January-September, 2019. San Antonio, Texas. Picture, if you will, the gated community of Inaqua Springs. This isn't just a neighborhood, it is a fortress. It is an enclave designed specifically to keep the unpredictability of the outside world firmly at bay. We are talking about sprawling, million-dollar estates. We are talking about around-the-clock private security details patrolling the winding, impeccably manicured streets. Surveillance cameras are mounted everywhere you look, their unblinking glass lenses capturing every vehicle, every license plate, every arrival, and every departure. People who move here pay an absolute fortune for one specific commodity: invulnerability. They live behind these towering iron gates because they genuinely believe that this is one of the safest, most impenetrable places imaginable. A place where tragedy simply cannot reach them. But on this crisp January morning, just after 9 a.m., that expensive illusion of safety is violently shattered. A call comes into the emergency services dispatch center. The operator on the other end of the line is used to hearing panic, but the story unfolding on this call is almost too horrific to process. The owner of one of these magnificent Inaqua Springs homes is on the line. He sounds frantic. His breathing is heavy. He tells the dispatcher that a nightmare has just taken place inside his walls. He claims that his girlfriend has just shot her 2 young daughters, and then, in the aftermath of that unimaginable violence, turned the gun on herself. Police cruisers, lights flashing and sirens wailing, tear through the quiet, sun-drenched streets of the community. When officers rush onto the scene, they find the homeowner standing outside on the flawless, green lawn of his sprawling estate. He is pacing. He appears entirely overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the horror. He is covering his face with his hands, the very picture of a man whose entire world has just collapsed. But almost immediately, as the seasoned responding officers step out of their vehicles and approach him, they notice a glaring, deeply unsettling anomaly. There isn't a single tear on his face. Inside the sprawling mansion, the air is heavy and silent. Detectives draw their weapons and clear the massive home, making their way up the sweeping staircase to the second floor. What they discover there is a scene of utter devastation. They find the bodies of 37-year-old Nicole Olson, 16-year-old Alexa, and 10-year-old London. A handgun is lying right beside Nicole's lifeless body, exactly as the frantic caller had described. It looks, at first glance, like a tragically open and shut case of murder-suicide. But there is just one massive, undeniable problem staring the detectives right in the face. The weapon lying on the floor does not belong to Nicole. It belongs to the very same man who is currently standing out on the manicured lawn, putting on a tearless display of profound grief. And then, as crime scene technicians begin meticulously documenting the room, something happens that completely changes the trajectory of the entire investigation. In the dim light of the room, the screen of Nicole's cell phone suddenly illuminates. A notification chimes. A routine, everyday text message arrives from a coworker at the hair salon where Nicole worked. The message simply reads, "Your client is already here." Think about the psychological implications of that for a moment. Would a woman who had supposedly just orchestrated the brutal execution of her entire family, a woman who was supposedly trapped in the depths of a suicidal psychosis, be making practical, forward-looking plans for her workday? Would she be confirming routine hair appointments with her morning clients? How did one of the most technologically secure, heavily guarded homes in the entire state of Texas become the scene of such a devastating, intimate crime? And why did the only surviving adult, the man whose gun was found beside the bodies, offer investigators a completely, flawlessly formed explanation from the very first second they arrived? To answer those chilling questions, we need to peel back the facade of the Inaqua Springs mansion. We need to find out who exactly came together under this luxurious roof, the vast differences in the lives they had lived, and the dark, suffocating secrets they had been keeping behind closed doors. To truly understand how these people ended up living in the same house, we need to go back several decades. When we trace their histories, what we find are two completely different worlds. Two vastly different American experiences that, under any normal circumstances, never would have crossed paths. Let's start with the woman at the center of this tragedy. Nicole Olson was born in 1981, and from a very young age, she was forced to learn what it meant to lose the people closest to her. Her childhood was not shielded by wealth or gated communities. In 1988, when Nicole was just a little girl, her father passed away from a fatal overdose involving prohibited substances. The trauma of that loss was immense, but the universe was not done testing her. In 2001, just as she was navigating young adulthood, her mother died from heart disease. Life did not give Nicole the luxury of a slow, carefree youth. It forced her to grow up incredibly fast. At the tender age of 15, a time when most teenagers are worrying about high school dances and driver's licenses, Nicole became a mother to her son, Skylar. She tried to build a traditional family, but the road was rocky. 2 brief marriages followed in her early 20s. First came a marriage to a man named James Nobles. Then, a marriage to Carlos Montes, a United States Marine. After her divorce from Carlos, she didn't crumble, she simply rolled up her sleeves and continued raising her older daughter, Alexa, on her own. Later in life, she entered a relationship with Hector Baescas, and together they welcomed her youngest daughter, beautiful little London. But life seemed absolutely determined to test this family's resilience at every conceivable turn. The financial burdens were suffocating. At one particularly dark point, unpaid child support obligations connected to her very first marriage ballooned to a staggering $24,000. Imagine that weight. Imagine waking up every single day knowing that mountain of debt is hanging over your head, threatening to crush the life you are trying to build for your children. Nicole didn't ask for a handout. She took whatever work she could find. She spent grueling hours working the cash register at a local Mexican restaurant. And because of the debt, part of every single paycheck she earned, money she desperately needed for groceries, for rent, for her kids, was automatically withheld by the state to help cover the arrears. Eventually, through sheer grit, she trained to become a cosmetologist. And for the next 10 years, this dedicated mother of 2 daughters practically lived inside the walls of salons by J.C. We are not talking about a standard 9 to 5. We are talking about double shifts. Triple shifts. Standing on her feet for 12, 14 hours a day, breathing in hairspray and chemicals, smiling for clients while her body ached. She pushed herself to the absolute physical and mental limit, supporting herself, her son, and her daughters through nothing but hard, unrelenting work alone. Every single dollar Nicole Olson ever earned came from long hours, fierce determination, and a stubborn refusal to give up, no matter how difficult or unfair things became. She was a survivor. She was a fighter. Now, I want you to take a much closer look at the man who was standing on that manicured lawn that January morning. Charlie Wheeler was born in 1986, but he was born into a universe entirely alien to the one Nicole knew. Charlie was born into a wealthy, highly influential family from Fredericksburg, Texas. His parents didn't worry about garnished paychecks, they owned a massive, sprawling ranch and made tens of millions of dollars through lucrative oil industry contracts. Charlie's life was paved with gold from day one. He dropped out of college during his freshman year, but unlike most dropouts who face immediate financial peril, Charlie simply followed in his wealthy father's footsteps and entered the world of professional rodeo. Later, he used his rodeo winnings, and the substantial backing of his family's empire, to launch a private security company that worked exclusively with massive oil production businesses. By the age of 24, Charlie Wheeler had successfully sold his first company, started another one, and reached an astonishing, almost incomprehensible level of personal income. At his peak, he was reportedly bringing in around $160,000 a day. For Charlie, money wasn't just currency, it was a shield. It was a magic wand that seemed to solve absolutely every problem in his life. And when you have that kind of money, the rules of society start to look more like mild suggestions. His history of run-ins with law enforcement reads exactly like the biography of someone who deeply believed the laws of the land simply did not apply to him. First, there was an arrest for public intoxication at an exclusive country club. Then came a highly disturbing drunk driving incident. According to official police reports, Wheeler didn't just pull over when the cops flashed their lights. He made a mocking, defiant gesture toward the police officer, shined a bright flashlight directly into the officer's eyes to blind him, and then sped away into the night. The officer eventually had to chase the millionaire down on foot. When Wheeler was finally physically stopped and detained, he flat out refused to take a breathalyzer test. He was so intoxicated he couldn't successfully count backward from 30 to 10. It seemed like an open and shut case of driving under the influence and evading arrest. Yet, for reasons that remain incredibly murky and unclear to the general public, the case completely fell apart. No serious jail time. No life-altering consequences. Incidents at high-end hotels followed the exact same, predictable pattern. Screaming arguments, violent disturbances, a night spent sobering up in a local holding cell, and then nothing. Very little consequence. Every single time, the final result was almost identical. Charges against the oil heir were quietly dismissed, drastically reduced, or replaced with minor, insignificant fines that he could pay out of his pocket change. Keep that psychological profile firmly in mind. For years, this was a man who repeatedly, brazenly crossed legal and moral boundaries, and the justice system seemed more than willing to look the other way. What do you think that does to a human being's mindset? Does it create a dark, deeply ingrained belief that there are no real consequences in life? That, if your bank account is large enough, absolutely anything is allowed? That brings us to an incredibly obvious question. What on earth could possibly connect the arrogant heir to a massive oil fortune with a humble, hardworking hairstylist who had spent her entire adult life relying solely on her own calloused hands? Their wildly different paths finally crossed in 2016. Charlie was scrolling through the internet and came across Nicole Olson's social media profile. At the time, the hardworking mother was trying a side hustle, helping promote a watch and jewelry brand she had launched with several of her friends. The millionaire saw her, liked what he saw, and sent her a direct message on Instagram. That simple, seemingly harmless digital message turned into long text conversations. The conversations quickly turned into an invitation for a date. For their very first meeting, Nicole was cautious. She arrived at a luxury resort, but she made sure she was accompanied by her good friend Vanessa. From the very beginning, Charlie was relentless. He was persistent, charming, and overwhelming. Before long, the relationship started moving at a terrifyingly rapid pace. The wealth was intoxicating. In April 2017, Charlie purchased the massive mansion in Aqua Springs, the very same home that would later become the gruesome focus of homicide investigators. The property measured roughly 4,500 square feet, featuring a pristine swimming pool, private neighborhood security, and strict, gated access. Not long afterward, Nicole packed up her life and moved in with her two daughters, Alexa and London. From the outside looking in, it looked as though Nicole had finally achieved the ultimate financial stability after a grueling lifetime of struggle. Charlie even offered her the opportunity that many might dream of. He told her she could quit working entirely. She could hang up her scissors, leave the salon behind, and live comfortably off his massive daily income. But Nicole refused. She continued taking her exhausting shifts at the salon. She insisted on maintaining her own, independent source of income. And honestly, looking back at the psychology of this case, that specific detail matters more than anything. Even with millions of dollars surrounding her, she actively chose to keep working. It was almost as if, deep down in her gut, she instinctively understood that becoming completely, financially dependent on a man like Charlie Wheeler carried severe, life-threatening risks. She wasn't willing to surrender her autonomy. So, while the sprawling mansion, the towering security gates, and the endless luxury lifestyle may have projected an image of absolute stability, Nicole secretly continued building a safety net of her own. And she needed that safety net, because the first violent warning sign showed up incredibly quickly. During a professional photo shoot for her jewelry line, Nicole arrived on set with a dark, highly noticeable bruise forming right under her eye. She had desperately tried to cover it with thick layers of foundation and concealer, but the purple-yellow discoloration was still clearly visible under the bright studio lights. When her friend Vanessa pulled her aside and asked what had happened, Nicole immediately brushed it off. She wouldn't make eye contact. She casually muttered that she and Charlie had gotten into a little argument, and then she immediately, nervously changed the subject. That same summer, the couple decided to celebrate their anniversary at a high-end resort hotel in Galveston, Texas. The romantic trip ended in absolute disaster. A ferocious argument escalated to the point that hotel security had to physically step in, restrain Charlie, and forcibly remove him from the resort property. Think about how a normal, reasonable person might handle that humiliating situation. Most people would gather their pride, pack their belongings, and leave quietly. Charlie did pack his things. But he took his retaliation a sadistic step further. He didn't just pack his own bags, he spitefully grabbed Nicole's luggage. He snatched her cell phone out of her hands. He got into his expensive car and sped away into the Texas heat. He intentionally left her completely alone, stranded in an unfamiliar city, with no clothes, no money, and absolutely no way to communicate with the outside world. Nicole eventually managed to borrow a phone and make her way to the home of a trusted friend named Monica. When she arrived, she was a broken woman. The two friends sat together and talked for 17 straight hours. Nicole wept uncontrollably. She didn't just describe a bad boyfriend, she described a terrifying campaign of ongoing, systematic humiliation and constant, suffocating emotional pressure. More importantly, looking her friend dead in the eye, she made a firm, resolute statement: "I'm leaving him." At least, that was the plan in the safety of Monica's living room. But the psychology of abuse is complex and gravity-heavy. The very next day, a defeated Nicole boarded a flight and returned to the invisible prison of the Aqua Springs mansion. After that deeply vulnerable conversation, Monica entirely disappeared from Nicole's life. The isolation had begun. As time painfully marched on, Charlie's obsessive need for control only became more apparent, morphing into a terrifying paranoia. In January 2018, Nicole and her friend Vanessa went to a simple basketball game together. While they were out enjoying a rare moment of freedom, Charlie began obsessively calling Nicole's phone. Over and over and over again. The screen wouldn't stop lighting up. Eventually, he demanded that Vanessa take the phone. When she put it to her ear, the millionaire delivered a cold, chillingly possessive comment: "You're lucky I even let her go with you." Later that evening, the two friends headed to a local jazz club to unwind. The barrage of phone calls instantly started again. Charlie had somehow digitally tracked their new location and furiously ordered Nicole to come back to the mansion immediately. That summer, Vanessa visited the couple at the Aqua Springs home. The two women were outside, relaxing in the warm water of the hot tub, trying to find a moment of peace. Suddenly, Charlie marched out into the backyard. His face was red. He was visibly, intensely furious. The reason for his rage was so petty it was almost unbelievable. Someone had accidentally dropped a tiny piece of pepperoni on the immaculate kitchen floor. Instead of simply picking it up, Charlie stood over the hot tub and aggressively ordered Nicole to get out of the water immediately and clean up after her daughters. He didn't just ask her to do it, he demanded it in a way that seemed highly intentional. It was designed to be public. It was designed to be profoundly degrading. Not long after the pepperoni incident, another massive argument erupted when the mansion's expensive surround sound audio system malfunctioned. Once again, Charlie immediately blamed the broken electronics entirely on Nicole's young daughters, screaming through the house. The atmosphere inside the home became so incredibly tense, so palpably dangerous, that Vanessa felt physically uncomfortable. She packed her things and left just 2 hours after arriving. As she was grabbing her bags and heading out the massive front door, Vanessa stopped. She looked at her beautiful, hardworking friend, and said something that would haunt them both. She said, "You look like a guest in your own house." Nicole's eyes dropped to the floor. She quietly, sadly nodded. "This is Charlie's house," she whispered. "Not mine." Vanessa walked out the door and never visited that house again. By that point, Charlie's campaign of isolation was nearly complete. Before long, Nickel rarely ever left the boundaries of the gated community, except to drive to the salon for work, or on the rare occasions when Charlie personally, explicitly approved her movements. Throughout the entirety of 2018, the toxic tensions inside the mansion continued to build like a pressure cooker. We do not know exactly what specific horrors were happening behind those heavy oak doors. What we do know, however, comes from cold, hard court records. During a 12-month period leading up to the tragedy, marked police patrol units with flashing lights were dispatched to that specific Aqua Springs address 4 separate times. The heavily redacted police documents do not reveal exactly what triggered those emergency 911 calls, but they do establish one absolutely vital, undeniable fact. Something volatile, something violent, something serious enough to repeatedly draw the attention of armed law enforcement officers kept happening inside that sprawling home. By then, Nickel had become a shadow of her former vibrant self. She was increasingly withdrawn, anxious, and had almost completely cut herself off from the outside world. But what Charlie Wheeler did not realize, and what no one else fully understood at the time, was that Nickel Olson was not broken. She was just being quiet. Under the radar, she had already started putting together a very real, very tangible exit plan. About a month before the horrific tragedy, she began actively, secretly searching for a new place to live. This was not a flighty, emotional decision made in the hysterical heat of an argument. It was cold. It was calculated. It was highly methodical. She quietly toured rental apartments on her lunch breaks. She compared financial options. She meticulously looked for a place that would be safe, affordable, and perfect for both her and her 2 teenage daughters. Now, let's dramatically slow down the clock. Let's meticulously examine the hour-by-hour timeline of January 9, 2019. This specific day is absolutely critical to the entire investigation, because the verified actions of Nickel Olson during these final hours violently conflict with the dark story that would later be presented to the police as the absolute truth. On the morning of January 9, Nickel woke up and checked her personal email. Sitting in her inbox was a message from the management office of an apartment complex she had recently toured. The news was exactly what she had been praying for. The unit she had been intensely interested in was finally available. The background check had cleared. The paperwork was ready to move forward. She could come in, sign the lease, and she could immediately start moving her belongings. For the very first time in what felt like an eternity, Nickel Olson had a clear, concrete path toward true independence. She was going to be free. Later in the afternoon, energized by the news, she handled her ordinary, everyday professional tasks. First, she picked up her phone, contacted a long-time, loyal client, and cheerfully confirmed a salon appointment for the very next day. Then, she spoke at length with her co-worker, Bethany, discussing upcoming schedules, swapping shifts, and mapping out work plans for the rest of the month. As the sun went down over Texas, at around 9 o'clock that evening, Hector, London's father, called the house. He wanted to talk to Nickel about plans for their daughter's future. The very next day, a massive casting event for a highly popular television talent show was being held in the San Antonio area, and 10-year-old London had been incredibly excited about the rare opportunity to audition. Nickel and Hector spent a long time discussing the pros and cons of the audition process. They talked about the stress of television, the commitment required. After talking it through like 2 rational, loving co-parents, they decided it might be better for London's well-being to wait a little longer, to let her grow up a bit more before pursuing such a high-pressure audition. Then, 10-year-old London took the phone herself and happily, joyfully chatted with her father before saying goodnight. I want you to take a deep breath and genuinely think about all of that evidence. Does this timeline, in any psychological universe, sound like the behavior of a woman who is secretly preparing to ruthlessly execute her own children and end her own life just a few hours later? Look at the undeniable facts. Nickel was actively reserving her workstation at the salon. She was carefully discussing future, long-term opportunities for her daughter's happiness. She had written confirmation that a brand new, safe apartment was waiting for her to pick up the keys. Every single hour of her following day was already meticulously planned out. By all logical appearances, she had finally taken the concrete, brave steps toward leaving Charlie Wheeler for good. As that Thursday evening continued, everything inside the mansion seemed completely, utterly normal. The atmosphere was calm. Nicole sat on the couch, exchanging light-hearted text messages with her old friend Vanessa, and chatted with several other acquaintances online. Nobody on the other end of those digital signals noticed a single sign of panic. No one noticed any deep despair. Nothing in her syntax, her emojis, or her tone suggested that anything was even slightly wrong. Then, late that night, the heavy front door swung open. Charlie came home. According to the official statements Charlie would later give to investigators, that exact moment was when a major, explosive argument broke out. The peaceful calm of the house was instantly shattered. The disagreement was supposedly so intense, so frightening, that Charlie would later describe it to the police as extremely serious. Not long afterward, Charlie grabbed his keys, stomped out to the massive garage, started the engine of his luxury vehicle, and drove out through the iron gates of the Aqua Springs community. According to his original, sworn account, the fight was so bad that he was simply heading out to stay with a friend for the night, hoping to let the fiery tempers cool down. And this, precisely right here, is where the narrative begins to crack. This is where the story begins to raise massive, deeply disturbing questions that defy all common sense. He claims he left behind a woman who was in the middle of a massive, psychologically unhinged breakdown. He claims she was dangerously emotionally unstable. And he deliberately left behind 16-year-old Alexa and 10-year-old London in her care. But after putting physical distance between himself and the mansion, he doesn't just drive to a friend's house and go to sleep. He pulls his car over. He pulls out his cell phone. And instead of simply letting things cool off, he begins frantically searching through his contact list to find the phone number of Nicole's brother, Justin. And from that exact moment forward, a highly calculated, incredibly strange chain of late-night digital events begins to unfold. It is a sequence of decisions and bizarre actions that, even today, seasoned detectives find almost impossible to explain through ordinary, innocent logic. The high-definition surveillance cameras mounted at the Aqua Springs community exit quietly, dutifully capture Wheeler's vehicle as it passes through the gates and leaves the property. So, yes, the physical evidence proves that Charlie really does drive away. And this is where the investigation steps out of the physical world and descends deeply into the matrix of digital evidence. Cell phone data logs and regional communication towers do not have personal opinions. They cannot be bribed. They do not forget inconvenient details. Unlike panicked human beings, they always leave a cold, mathematical trail that can be perfectly reconstructed by forensic experts. Everything we know about the dark hours of the rest of that night comes almost entirely from phones, text messages, and digital ping records. After leaving the gates of the community, Charlie doesn't just settle in on a buddy's couch. Instead, he launches into an absolute wave of frantic text messaging. He begins firing off message after message to Nicole. He texts both of her teenage daughters. He texts Nicole's brother, Justin. And the theme of every single one of these midnight messages remains remarkably, almost suspiciously consistent. According to the digital trail Charlie is actively creating, he is portraying himself as deeply, profoundly concerned about Nicole's fragile emotional state following their massive argument. Take a massive step back and look at that specific behavior from the outside. You have just stormed out of your own house. You are desperately telling her extended family members that your partner may be experiencing a severe, dangerous emotional crisis. Two young, vulnerable girls are still trapped inside that home with her. If the situation is truly that volatile, if your fear for her sanity is genuine, why on earth are you sitting in a parked car spending the night sending text messages? Any rational person in genuine fear would either slam the car into reverse and go back to the house immediately, or they would dial 911 and beg emergency services to rush over for a high-priority welfare check. But Charlie doesn't call the cops. Instead, he sits in the dark, meticulously creating a permanent, time-stamped written record of his supposed concern. It is the perfect digital alibi. Then, a singular, terrifying detail appears in the digital timeline that warps the entire perspective of the case. A text message suddenly arrives on Charlie's phone. It is sent from 16-year-old Alexa's phone number. The text reads, "Are you here?" I think she's talking to herself. A wide-eyed, frightened face emoji is attached to the very end of the sentence. Think incredibly carefully about the phrasing of that text. Why would a terrified teenager text the homeowner to ask if he was inside the house, when he had supposedly just engaged in a massive, screaming argument that ended with him slamming the door and visibly driving away? And notice, just notice, how flawlessly, how neatly those specific words, "she's talking to herself," fit into the exact explanation that Charlie would later offer the police about Nickel having a sudden, violent mental breakdown. Here is the most terrifying truth about modern digital forensics: phones perfectly record messages. But they absolutely do not record who was physically holding the glass device at the exact moment a message was typed and sent. A touch screen does not preserve the fingerprints of the author. The message undoubtedly exists in the server logs. But the identity of the physical person who typed it? That is an entirely different, incredibly dark question. As the digital clock on the cell towers moves closer to 11 p.m. that night, the activity suddenly shifts entirely to Nickel's phone. Exactly 5 outgoing phone calls are urgently placed in the dark. The first call dials out to Charlie's mother. It rings and rings. She doesn't answer. The remaining 4 calls are all dialed to the exact same number, 911. Take a profound moment to consider the sheer terror of that fact. 4 separate, desperate attempts are made from Nickel's phone to reach emergency dispatchers. Out of those 4 attempts, only one single call successfully connects to the dispatch center. A 911 operator answers the line, ready to dispatch police. But there is nothing but complete, absolute, haunting silence on the other end of the connection. There is no frantic shouting. There is no heated conversation in the background. There are no whispered pleas for help. There are absolutely no sounds that explain what violence is unfolding inside that mansion. Before the operator can initiate a GPS trace on the exact coordinates, the connection is abruptly cut off. The call dies before operators are able to determine the caller's precise room location. And tragically, fatally, no return call is made by dispatch to investigate the dead air. Morning slowly arrives over Aqua Springs on January 10th. The sun rises over the million-dollar homes. At 7:30 a.m., Charlie picks up his phone and reaches out to Nickel's brother, Justin, one final time. His text message reads, "Have you heard from her? Should I call the police?" He sends the text, and then he waits. He waits another hour and a half in the morning light. Only after 9 a.m. does his luxury vehicle finally return through the community gates. He parks, walks inside his silent home, and then, and only then, does he place the frantic 911 call that opened this entire tragic story. The security cameras at the front gate perfectly confirmed that Charlie was physically, undeniably absent from the house during the darkest hours of the night. His cell phone had created what appeared to be an absolutely airtight, perfect digital timeline of the worried, absent boyfriend. Now, the homicide detectives had the monumental task of taking that pristine digital timeline and comparing it with the messy, bloody, physical evidence waiting for them inside the mansion. And this, infuriatingly, is where the police investigation begins taking bizarre, sharp turns that seasoned legal observers found entirely impossible to understand. The sprawling crime scene is slowly processed. The 3 bodies are carefully zipped into bags and removed from the property. The case officially moves out of the hands of the patrol officers and into the hands of the lead investigators. Bexar County Sheriff Javier Salazar confidently steps in front of a podium surrounded by flashing press cameras. He looks directly into the local news lenses and officially identifies Charlie Wheeler as a person of interest. But at the exact same time, in a move that stuns veteran defense attorneys and crime scene analysts across the country, the county medical examiner rushes to the microphones and presents a remarkably, almost suspiciously definitive conclusion. Without waiting for the weeks it usually takes for complex forensic toxicology and blood spatter analysis to return from the state lab, the medical examiner announces the official finding: the incident was a tragic double murder-suicide. They declare, unequivocally, that Nicole Olson murdered her two daughters in cold blood, and then placed the gun to her own head. Let's pause the tape right there for a moment and apply some basic, elementary forensic logic. What hard, undeniable physical evidence could have possibly supported such a firm, permanent conclusion so incredibly early in the investigative process? In any criminal case involving discharged firearms, one of the most fundamental, absolute vital forensic questions is gunshot residue, commonly known as GSR. When a weapon is fired, an invisible cloud of microscopic chemical dust violently erupts from the barrel and coats the hands, the arms, and the clothing of the person pulling the trigger. Were comprehensive GSR tests immediately performed on Nicole's hands to prove she fired the weapon? Were similar, highly urgent swab tests conducted on Charlie's hands and clothing the absolute second he returned to the scene the following morning? Authorities have never, to this day, publicly released those laboratory results. Not a single forensic document has ever been presented to the grieving public showing definitive, scientific proof that Nicole Olson physically pulled the trigger of that weapon. And there is another absolutely critical, glaring detail we need to keep at the forefront of our minds. The firearm found at the scene, the murder weapon, was legally registered to Charlie Wheeler. According to official police records, that specific gun was routinely stored in the top drawer of his bedside table. And it was reportedly kept in that drawer completely loaded, with the safety mechanism totally disengaged, ready to fire at a moment's notice. Naturally, in any forensic swab, his fingerprints would be expected to be completely plastered all over that weapon. It was his gun. And because the couple lived together in that master suite, the presence of his biological DNA traces, his skin cells, his hair, absolutely anywhere inside that bloody bedroom could be instantly, legally explained away as nothing more than ordinary, innocent daily contact. The crime scene was, by definition, his personal sanctuary. Now, look incredibly closely at the actions of the only surviving adult connected to this massacre. Rather than actively assisting the baffled investigators, rather than sitting in an interrogation room for days answering every single question to clear his name and find justice for the woman he supposedly loved, Charlie Wheeler instantly lawyered up. He hired a team of high-powered, incredibly expensive defense attorneys. Under their strict advice, he flatly declined any further cooperation with the police investigation. He closed his mouth, and he closed his doors. But what stands out even more, what speaks volumes about the psychology of this case, is how he interacted with the devastated families left behind in the wreckage. Just hours earlier, he had been frantically sending message after text message to Nicole's brother, supposedly weeping with profound concern about her emotional condition. But now that the bodies were cold? According to those intimately close to the case, Charlie completely withdrew into his fortress. He never once reached out to Carlos, Alexa's father. He never once called Hector, the father of 10-year-old London, to offer even a shred of condolences for the slaughter of his little girl. Nothing. No phone call. No text message. No flowers. Absolutely no human contact at all. Carlos and Hector, bonded by an unimaginable grief, absolutely refused to accept the medical examiner's rushed, neat little explanation without question. Both men went to the media and publicly, fiercely described Nicole as a fiercely devoted, loving mother who, in their unshakable view, would never, under any form of psychosis or duress, have harmed a single hair on the heads of Alexa or London. They demanded a fully transparent, deep-dive investigation. They wanted blood spatter experts. They wanted digital forensics. They did not want a convenient conclusion reached before every single hard question had been answered. The panicked response from local authorities sparked even more furious controversy. Sheriff Javier Salazar, feeling the immense heat of public scrutiny, held yet another press conference. But instead of presenting the public with new physical evidence to back up his department's suicide theory, he unexpectedly, and highly unprofessionally, shifted the entire discussion toward deeply personal, unsubstantiated rumors. During the live briefing, the sheriff recklessly suggested that in a final, frantic phone conversation, Nicole had suddenly raised dark questions about Hector's true paternity of London, implying that this sudden revelation drove her to murder. Think about how wildly inappropriate and unusual that was. The county's top, highest-ranking law enforcement official was standing at a podium, publicly repeating a totally unverified, dirty rumor, while a grieving, broken father was desperately searching the streets for answers about his murdered 10-year-old daughter. Days later, facing immense backlash and threats of legal action, Sheriff Salazar had to humiliatingly walk back those comments after absolutely zero supporting evidence emerged to back up the claim. The incident pulled back the curtain and revealed something incredibly important about the direction of the police case. Rather than easing the public's concerns with cold, hard science, the police department's blundering only proved how disorganized and desperate they were to close the file. Questions from furious family members and investigative journalists continued to multiply. Access to crime scene photos and investigative materials became heavily redacted and increasingly limited. The flow of new information slowed to a miserable trickle, and Charlie Wheeler's official status as a person of interest remained permanently frozen in place. He wasn't cleared, but he wasn't charged. No major changes. No public resolution. Which leaves us, the observers, with a monumental challenge that the police investigation never, ever fully addressed. We have to take the immaculate digital trail from that night, the texts, the pings, the calls, and lay it directly over the bloody, physical realities of what actually happened inside the walls of that house. Let's place the cell tower records right alongside the physical, 3D layout of the mansion's second floor. We are back on the dark, fateful night of January 9, 2019. A wealthy, powerful man steps through the heavy front door of the mansion. By this exact point in time, Nicole already has the confirmed email approval for a brand new apartment. She no longer needs his roof. She no longer depends on his oil money. She finally, truly, has a way out. A massive argument begins in the foyer. A man who had spent his entire adult life navigating his problems through immense financial influence, powerful family connections, and pure intimidation is suddenly faced with a woman providing direct, unshakable resistance. She is leaving him. The total system of control that had defined his relationship for years appears to be rapidly breaking down in front of his eyes. The verbal confrontation violently escalates. At some terrifying point in the night, the deafening roar of gunfire erupts through the massive house. 3 innocent people violently collapse to the floor. And when the police eventually arrive, all 3 bodies are ultimately found on the exact same upper level of the house, lying not far from one another in a pool of blood. And according to the dark, lingering questions that would later surround and consume this case, this is the exact moment when the crime scene may have begun taking on a very, very different significance. Because if someone else pulled that trigger, that someone would desperately need the physical facts of the room to perfectly fit a very specific, rehearsed explanation. Look at the bloody aftermath through the cold, unforgiving lens of simple logic. If you are genuinely leaving a home because you are terrified by the violently unstable, suicidal behavior of your partner, and you know for a fact that 16-year-old Alexa and 10-year-old London are still asleep upstairs, would you leave a fully loaded, unsecured firearm sitting within her easy reach? Most human beings experiencing real, genuine concern for the lives of children would instinctively grab the weapon, take it with them to the car, or at the absolute very least, unload the magazine and lock the gun away somewhere entirely inaccessible. Yet, magically, the firearm remains exactly where it needs to be. It remains exactly where it would later become the central, foundational piece of the police department's official murder-suicide narrative. Then, the cell phones enter the terrifying picture. Who physically held the glass screen? Who physically unlocked Alexa's device and rapidly typed out the message about her mother talking to herself? If a frightened teenager was truly hiding in a closet, urgently, quietly typing that text for help, why were all 3 individuals ultimately found lying dead together in the open, without any obvious physical indication of a desperate attempt to run or flee the house. As we established, a touch screen does not preserve fingerprints. The text message undoubtedly exists. But the identity of the person whose thumb hit send is another question entirely. And that digital trail just happens to fit remarkably, perfectly, conveniently well with the explanation that Nickel had suddenly suffered a violent mental breakdown. Then we come back to what may be the absolute most unsettling, haunting part of the entire timeline. Think back to those 4 silent 911 calls placed to emergency services as the clock neared midnight. Were they the final, agonizing attempts of a bleeding, dying woman trying desperately to summon the police to save her children? Or was someone else standing over the bodies? Was someone else frantically handling her bloody phone, quickly reviewing the call logs, deleting incriminating text messages, and in their panicked haste, accidentally triggering the phone's emergency SOS sequence? Leaving the 911 dispatchers with nothing but the chilling sound of silence on the other end of the line. Those dark questions have fueled endless debate and amateur investigations ever since the bodies were found. At some point in the deep night, the firearm is carefully positioned right beside Nickel's lifeless hand. And only after every single piece of the gruesome scene appears to be perfectly, meticulously in place, does the loud roar of a luxury vehicle engine start outside in the driveway. Moments later, that vehicle passes through the towering iron community gates. The unblinking surveillance cameras dutifully record it leaving the property. Compare those two realities for a moment in your mind. A person cannot furiously storm out of a house after an argument, drive away into the night, and at the exact same time be physically responsible for the horrific, bloody events that had already unfolded inside the house. Digital evidence is brutally unforgiving when it comes to timelines. The security footage shows Charlie leaving. But it only proves he left after whatever happened inside the house had already concluded. It does not prove he left before the trigger was pulled. From that point on, all of his activity completely shifts to the outside of the gated community. Sitting in the safety of the dark, he continues sending text message after text message, perfectly building the digital image of a worried, absent partner. While inside the silent mansion, the bloody scene remained completely unchanged, waiting for the sun to rise. Eventually, as the months dragged into years, the police investigation reached a frustrating, agonizing standstill. When authorities stubbornly stop providing answers, grieving families are inevitably forced to begin searching for their own kind of justice. In the year 2020, tired of waiting for the police to act, Carlos and Hector filed massive civil lawsuits against Charlie Wheeler, the only surviving resident of the mansion. Their legal claim in the civil courts was painfully straightforward. They sued for gross negligence and reckless conduct that they firmly believed directly contributed to the violent deaths of Alexa and London. Their legal argument brilliantly focused on the glaring contradictions in Charlie's own sworn account. The lawyers argued that even if a jury magically accepts the police department's official version of events, even if they believe Nickel pulled the trigger, the central question remains exactly the same. Charlie repeatedly, documented through his own text messages, told others that Nickel was in a state of severe, dangerous emotional distress. He claimed, in writing, to be deeply terrified about her unstable behavior. He also knew, for an absolute fact, that young Alexa and London were trapped inside the home with her. Yet, by his own admission, he allegedly left a fully loaded, unlocked firearm behind in that exact environment, and then drove away. The grieving families argued before a judge that creating such a highly volatile, deadly situation raised massive, criminal questions on its own merit. The local law enforcement agencies offered absolutely no public response to the civil suit. They remained silent. As the agony of frustration grew to a boiling point, the desperate families turned to Project Cold Case, a national non-profit organization that connects grieving families with retired, experienced homicide investigators to review dead, unresolved cases. With official police answers becoming harder and harder to obtain, the relatives furiously pursued every single legal avenue available to them in a desperate effort to keep the search for the absolute truth alive in the public eye. The emotional pressure finally reached its absolute peak on Thanksgiving Day, historically one of the most important, family-oriented holidays in America. Hector, the grieving father of London, specifically chose that family holiday to make his agonizing frustration public. While other families were carving turkeys in their warm homes, Hector organized a loud, passionate protest directly outside the doors of the local police department. He held signs. He shouted through megaphones, demanding ultimate transparency and a real, unbiased review of the physical blood evidence. But the heavy doors of the police department did not open. The department did not move an inch. Years have now passed. The brutal case involving 3 bloody bodies inside a highly secured, heavily guarded gated community still remains officially, infuriatingly unresolved by the courts. The county medical examiner's incredibly hasty conclusion about Nicole taking her own life after the brutal slaughter of her daughters has never, not once, been backed publicly by the kind of irrefutable, scientific forensic proof that the families, and the public, expect and demand to see. And the wealthy man whose fingerprints could easily appear all over the murder weapon, simply because it was his home and his gun, remains entirely, completely free. We started this stark story looking at the towering gates of Inaqua Springs. A place built entirely around the modern promise of high-definition security cameras, guarded iron gates, and the absolute guarantee of protection from the evils of the outside world. That is the bitter, truly sickening irony of this entire tragedy. The expensive security system worked flawlessly. It did exactly what it was designed to do. Just not in the way the residents ever imagined. The high walls and the iron gates did absolutely nothing to protect Nicole, Alexa, and London from the horror inside that house. But the unblinking cameras did perfectly record a highly convenient exit time for a man who needed one. The private, secluded setting kept pesky outside witnesses far, far away from the screams. And the exact same expensive security apparatus that was meant to protect the innocent from murderers may have just helped create the absolute perfect alibi. That is exactly where the confirmed, undeniable facts end, locked away behind the closed, dusty files of the Texas justice system. Trust the logic. Check every single bloody detail. And never, ever accept a convenient coincidence at a crime scene.